Coming up on the Threat Status Podcast, we talk to former CIA official Ted Singer about potential security threats at the Paris Olympic Games. And then we dive into the disputed Venezuelan election, China's role in the Russia-Ukraine war, and a lot more. Don't forget to go to WashingtonTimes.com and sign up for the daily Threat Status newsletter. Hello and welcome to the Threat Status Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wolfgang, national security correspondent at the Washington Times, and I am joined as always by Guy Taylor, my co-host and the national security editor here at the Washington Times. We've got former intelligence official Ted Singer coming up later in the show to talk about the Olympics and the potential security threats there. But, you know, the summer period here, July and August, we typically say is a slow news time in our business, but that is definitely not the case this year, to say the least. There have been so many developments all around the world over just the past week or two that my head is spinning a little bit here, but we're going to break it down for you as best we can, as always. So with that in mind, Guy, first things first, what's on your radar right now?
Thanks, Ben. Amazing to be here once again. Let's start with the Olympics and an update on the medal count, Ben. China is out of the gate, and they've won more gold medals than anyone else so far. Although we're still early in the games, the U.S. has the most medals, gold, bronze, silver. And there's great geopolitical significance to the medal count. Or is there? I think we can leave that to our listeners to debate. I'm looking forward to digging into the security issues surrounding the Olympics with former U.S. intelligence official Ted Singer later in the podcast. For my part, Ben, I've been in Palo Alto, California the past few days, meeting with national security experts at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. That's the think tank headed by former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. It's also where a slew of other former U.S. officials hang out. I met with H.R. McMaster here, as well as Philip Zelikow, the historian diplomat. One takeaway is there's definitely a growing sense among many former high-level national security folks here that the world today is edging dangerously close to global conflict, with the alignment of China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran at the center of concerns, given that the alignment anchors around a collective view among the authoritarian governments of those four nations that the U.S.-led order of democracies, free markets, and security around the world has wronged them. In many ways, the situation is comparable to the interwar period between World War I and World War II. Ben, we'll be diving into all of that with some threat status video interviews coming out over the next couple of weeks. I want to come back down to the ground level, though, and highlight a few other developments just from the past few days. The first one is the massive prisoner swap that's been agreed to between the U.S. and Russia. Moscow has released American journalist Evan Gershkovich and former U.S. Marine Paul Whelan, both of whom had been wrongly imprisoned in Russia on bogus espionage charges. Several Russian dissidents were also released in a multinational deal that's really the biggest U.S.-Russia prisoner swap since the fall of the Soviet Union decades ago. There are, of course, signs of imbalance in the deal. The Russian side got the release of Vadim Krasikov, who was convicted in Germany in 2021 of killing a former Chechen rebel in a Berlin park a couple of years prior to 2021. Apparently, that killing was on the orders of Moscow's security services. The Russians also got the release of alleged sleeper cell agents who were jailed in Slovenia and 3 men who had been held in the United States. So there are concerns here about whether the U.S. gave away too much in this deal, Ben, that Russia essentially freed journalists, dissidents, and others who'd been convicted of totally dubious charges of espionage, while Russia got back people who actually committed crimes in the West, including murder. That's something that will be debated going forward, and I could see it becoming politicized in the U.S. presidential race. We'll see. Let's jump, though. One other development on my radar is the political crisis in Venezuela, where socialist President Nicolas Maduro is basically refusing to step down despite losing an election. The country now faces massive and escalating protests from opposition. Venezuela is a major oil producer in the Western Hemisphere. What I want to point out, Ben, is who around the world is recognizing Maduro's claim to victory. It's China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, and a tiny number of others in their orbit. While the U.S., Europe, and most of the rest of the world are standing together in calls for Maduro to realize he's lost.
Yeah. I'm going to talk a little bit more about Venezuela later in the show because I think you're right. It's an important issue that we're tracking closely here. There's a lot of fast-moving developments elsewhere in the world, especially in the Middle East this week, namely involving Israel and Iran, starting with the apparent assassination of Hamas political leader Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran earlier this week. Now, Israel hasn't officially claimed responsibility for his death, but it's widely believed to have been an Israeli operation. And there's some pretty fascinating details coming out about the operation itself. The New York Times has a great piece quoting a bunch of regional security sources about how apparently a bomb was smuggled into the Tehran guest house where he was staying. He was in Tehran to attend the inauguration of Iran's new president. There's a lot to unpack with that operation, not the least of which is the impact it's going to have on ceasefire negotiations. The prime minister of Qatar came out shortly after, just hours after, and said, how can these ceasefire negotiations continue in good faith when, according to him, one side kills the lead negotiator of the other side? And Haniyeh was Hamas' top negotiator in those talks. That sums up a lot of the thinking in the Arab world, certainly, about this. That's up in the air, to say the least. But for Israel, it's the latest in a series of high-profile strikes targeting top commanders in both Hamas and Lebanese Hezbollah. And a couple of weeks ago, they targeted the Houthis in Yemen, the first time that they ever struck targets in Yemen. So my big picture takeaway here is this. We talked a lot in the show about this idea of escalation. The Biden administration keeps saying we want to prevent escalation, prevent a wider war. That's goal number one. But I think escalation's here. It's happening now, and it's been unfolding in front of our eyes, really, for the past few weeks. There's not a bright, flashing red line guy that says escalation on it, and somebody steps over it, and it's crossed, and all of a sudden everybody knows we've reached the tipping point. That's not how this stuff works. It comes gradually, one incident after another, and that's what we've seen. Israel's now routinely believed to be responsible for strikes in Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, and Iran. The Houthis are targeting ships at sea. Iranian Shia militias target U.S. troops in Iraq and Syria. We've had Iran launch direct attacks at Israel. They might do it again soon. We'll see. Supreme leaders called for revenge, and Iranian officials are reportedly meeting with Iranian proxy networks right now as we're taping the show to decide how they're going to respond. So I guess I'm coming to the conclusion essentially that this idea of, quote, preventing escalation, unquote, has outlived its usefulness as a term, as a way to think about this conflict. It's escalated. Now it's a matter of how do you stop it, or perhaps how do you help Israel achieve its goals so maybe the conflict can end for good. I talked exclusively this week to retired General Kenneth McKenzie, the former head of U.S. Central Command, and he told me that, quote, preventing escalation can't be your highest priority. If it is, you need to leave the region. We talk a lot about preventing escalation, and we should, but that can't be your highest priority. You have to have other priorities, unquote. I think he's dead on, 100% correct guy. If the Biden administration's goal was to prevent escalation, I think it's failed. So what's the plan now? I guess we'll see, but we're certainly at probably what is the most pivotal moment since the October 7th attacks. And we are joined now by Ted Singer. Ted recently wrapped up a 35-year federal career, which included oversight of some of CIA's largest operational units and receipt of some of the intelligence community's highest honors. He served 25 years overseas, including 5 times as chief of station in politically sensitive postings, global hotspots. Ted, I think it's fair to say you're a case officer's case officer, and we're excited to have you here today, so you can give us, your unique take on whether these Paris Olympic Games will, end with athletic world records or become yet another flashpoint threat. So, Ted, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us here.
Thank you, Guy and Ben, and thanks for inviting me on to Threat Status Podcast.
Of course. So heading into the games, you've written and spoken about sort of three general threats to the games, and that you and presumably the French authorities were concerned about in the weeks, months, days leading up to the games. Can you just give us and our listeners kind of a quick, brief overview of what those three threats are?
Yeah, I'm going to even dial it back a little further in history, since we're halfway through the games almost. But remember, the last time France hosted the Summer Games was 1924. 1924, Europe, the world is coming out of World War I and breathing a collective sigh of relief. The world was coming out of the Spanish flu pandemic, and I saw some uncanny parallels to today. Similar borders, front lines of wars, hot wars in which France is directly involved. And this is the first post-pandemic Olympics that France is hosting. The three sort of outlined threats that I sense still are at play and risking the games, and for which the French well prepared with their allies, with their friends. First, it's Russia, Russia, Russia. Russia has the means and motive to discredit France, to disrupt the games, to avenge IOC decisions to ban its athletes. And this is mostly in reflection of France's unstinting support to Ukraine. So these threats would be in the context of cyber attacks, disinformation attacks, and potentially some of the gray kind of warfare that we've seen, some of these arson attacks that have popped up around Europe that I can get into a little bit later when we dig into some of them. The second bucket of threats is international terrorism. France's former colonies in North Africa and the Sahel, virtually every one of them has an existing Islamic extremism problem, and a series of coups across the Sahel and North Africa, fostered by, abetted by, stoked by Wagner mercenaries and the Russians, basically kicked France out of its former colonies where it had some CT forces deployed. We too, the United States, are being invited to leave Niger soon for similar reasons. This is leaving a big sort of gaping CT void that gives me worry and gives France worry as far as the Olympic Games are concerned. Additionally, since the 22 March attack by ISIS-K in Moscow, France has been on its highest counterterrorism alert level. So they've been sustaining a pretty high tempo. And I want to remind sort of listeners and you all that France had a significant number of its citizens and residents involved with ISIS when it was at its peak in northern Syria and in Iraq, the Caliphate time. The third bucket of threats that the French are worried about and well prepared for is domestic unrest or violence. Paris, for France, is home to Europe's largest Jewish population and one of the largest Muslim populations in Europe. France has been steadfast in its support to Israel since the gruesome October 7th attacks. And by France's own account, it did participate in operations to thwart Iran's aerial assault against Israel. So those are the three major buckets. We don't want to look at them each individually because they're all potentially interrelated. And by that, I mean nation states, think Russia, colluding with bad actors or criminals and picking at some of the social seams and political discord to wreak havoc in France.
Ted, it's Guy. Thank you. There's a lot to unpack there. Let me ask what might really sound like a very obvious question, but I think your perspective might be really highly valuable on this. Why would the Olympics be appealing as a target for a terrorist group beyond the potential physical destruction or loss of life? From a psychological and strategic standpoint, what messaging could extremists or a terror group or others be trying to achieve with an attack on the Olympics?
I guess first and foremost, it's always a challenge to comprehend the motives of terrorists, whether it's an organized group or lone wolves. Some seek revenge, some want fame and fortune. Some of the religiously motivated individuals may actually seek martyrdom. Some of the groups actually write what their plans and intentions are. Sometimes we just fail to read the fine print of why they're threatening a certain country. Go back to 9/11 and Osama bin Laden's manifesto against the United States. It was there in black and white. On terrorism per se, let me maybe enumerate a few. Let's say ISIS in particular, it has the means and motive to attack France. France lobbied to host the 2024 Summer Games as a direct result of a series of gruesome ISIS attacks, some by lone wolves, some by organized individuals in 2015. I think you as journalists will clearly remember the gruesomeness that occurred at Charlie Hebdo, a French publication. So France lobbied for the Olympics, partly to sort of show the world that the City of Light had tackled this terrorism problem and it was behind them. That said, France has a significant number of folks who were imprisoned, who were ISIS members, who have gotten out, and there are a significant number of French citizens who remain sort of in custody in Kurdish prisons in northern Syria and Iraq. So ISIS has a means and a motive, and we've seen them already attack Moscow. We saw them attack Iran, and we've seen the French actually have arrested a couple of individuals that are probably linked to ISIS. We'll see the evidence probably when the Olympics are done. I would say too that on the terrorist front, I mentioned sort of the French getting asked to leave some of its former colonies where it had pretty significant led CT operations, frankly, for the West. So there is sort of a gaping wound there, or a gaping void there that terrorists, both ISIS and Al Qaeda, siding with some of the local population and listening to Wagner and Russian propaganda that a lot of Africa, those countries' woes are a direct result of France colonialism, colonial legacy, and exploiting their former quote unquote garden, as they used to call it. The last sort of attraction of attacking France is just its cultural symbolism, its fraternité, its liberté, it's one of those cities that would anybody with a message to make could probably find somewhere to make that message loud and proud while the world's eyes are on it. And I would say it's not terrorism per se, but I would also say, as we talk about the global power structure or the axis of resistance or the axis of disorder, there are other countries, nation states, China included, that probably don't necessarily want France to shine.
Ted, are you worried? You mentioned the attacks we've seen so far, and as you said, we're about halfway point almost of the games. We've already seen a couple of those. The attack on rail lines just as the games were getting underway. Earlier this week, French authorities said they suspected that their vandals cut telecom cables in the Paris area. Do you expect those kinds of things to continue? What are you watching for on the back half of the games? And is the fact that those minor incidents, not that no one was killed, thank goodness, but is that indicative of the French missing something? Did they do anything wrong, or are those types of incidents just kind of inevitable because of all the factors you just laid out?
I think it was probably inevitable, and you highlighted sort of two incidents that made the front page because the Olympics started. But let me just give you a couple of anecdotes of things that the French have thwarted. And my guess is on this back half, will continue to have to thwart to prevent havoc at the games, disruptions of the games, and let's knock on wood again, loss of life. So the French security services, they've got a huge list of unwanted people. It's called Fiche S. That's the name of their sort of watch list. Thousands of people on this. And they've turned away a lot of people who were seeking to enter France for the games. And a lot of these were intelligence officers from places like Russia. A lot of them were suspect terrorism individuals, and a lot of them were probably just disruptive type of personalities. So they have turned away hundreds, if not thousands, of individuals who were applying to come into France or through cooperation with friendly European neighbors, not to get into the Schengen zone to attend the games and come across via train, etc. Let me highlight a couple of things that didn't necessarily make the front pages. U.S. let's say commercial security, cybersecurity companies highlighted recently some misinformation from Russia, which was an AI video that made it appear as if CIA had issued a warning to Americans about traveling on the Paris metro. This went viral. Last month, there was another fabricated video containing a fake warning about the risk of using the metro there in Paris. This originated in Russian channels, then jumped over to X, jumped over to Facebook, and had about 100,000 views across different platforms. This fabricated video came from the same Russian disinformation network that used AI not too long ago to create a Netflix feature-length film with Tom Cruise. Another video was published on Telegram, Russia's favorite platform, using the France 24, which is their sort of CNN branding, which claimed to show a French official criticizing my old organization, CIA, for alarming the public for this Paris metro terror threat. And this was also attributed to a Russian disinformation network. Earlier this month, there was a fabricated video, don't know who created it, purporting a Hamas terrorist threat against the Olympics. Turned out to be a fabricated video. In June, Russian hacktivists shut down French cultural website where folks would go to get tickets to enter some of the beautiful museums and other cultural attractions there. France has arrested any number of bad actors, some terrorists. On the Russian front, they arrested a dual citizen who looked as if he was part of this sort of gray war that Russia's up to disrupt supply chains leading to Ukraine. My favorite, though, guys, was the arrest last week of a Russian reality TV chef who was operating undercover in Paris and drunkenly blabbed that he was there to disrupt the games. So it's been nonstop activity. It just hasn't sort of made the cut.
One more that I really want to ask you while we still have you, because time is getting a little bit short, but can we talk a little bit about this kind of mind-blowing security preparations in the international context? How deeply are U.S. law enforcement, intelligence, and national securities woven into France's preparations? And one of the reasons I'm asking is, are there too many cooks in the kitchen? Does that create potential problems? Or do international partners generally work well in these situations, particularly when we're talking about athletes from all over the world that are there? It's not just, we've got Russian athletes, we've got Chinese athletes, we've got Americans, Africans, Middle Easterners, everybody's there.
France has hosted many, many world events, some of the highest profile negotiations, some of the highest profile summits. So they're good at this. All right, let's give them credit where credit's due. First. Second, this is going to take a village, an Olympic village, to pull this off and prevent harm, utter disruption, embarrassment. And France's allies, including the United States, France is our oldest allies, have France's back. I just saw the video last night. I live in Northern Virginia, and I saw some Fairfax County police officers with their K9 unit headed out to help augment French police forces there, relieve them, spell them. This is hard. So all of France's neighbors are responding to France's request to help augment police forces, to help augment K9 forces, in some cases replacing or supplementing French, some cases policing kind of their own Olympic village type spaces to spell French forces. France has about 35 police and gendarmes each day on the streets, managing crowds, etc. It's hot as you know what in France at this time of year, so these guys are working around the clock. The U.S., since pretty much before 9/11, but certainly after 9/11, has augmented and surged folks to support allies, especially when there are major world events with large US populations at them. And this year is no different. There is a great sort of public facing, public private element called the Overseas Security Advisory Council, which is run by State Department. And that's where US businesses and the US government sort of meet and can share intelligence threats or share security risk information. So there are allies. I will tell you this too. France has great partnerships throughout the EU, and each of those ministries of interior is working double time to help protect France's borders in terms of bad actors getting in and crossing borders. And then the amount of intelligence sharing that goes on in and among the allies to protect these games, the athletes and the attendees. The U.S. taxpayers, I think, getting its money's worth.
Ted Singer, thank you so much for joining us here. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Ted.
You're welcome, guys. Thank you.
And it's now time for Threats of the Week, our weekly segment here on the show where Guy and I each identify a threat, either at home or around the world, that we think is affecting U.S. national security right now this week as you all are listening to the show. So, Guy, what do you have for us for your Threat of the Week?
My threat of the week is China's ongoing support for Russia's war in Ukraine. If you step way back, you could make an argument that it's almost like Beijing is waging or engaging in a proxy war in Ukraine, supporting one side as a way to test the West and learn about the true extent of Western and NATO cohesion and responsiveness. Why this should concern us is because it sets a precedent for what China can do in terms of supporting authoritarian powers and engaging in proxy activity, whether it's in Myanmar or Sudan or Vietnam or somewhere else. Remember, a common narrative is that Ukraine matters in great power politics because if the West allows Russia to win, China will see that as a signal that the U.S. and its allies would allow China to win in a war against Taiwan. But there's another aspect to it, which is that it could shape how China views engagement in conflict around the world beyond Taiwan going forward. And my threat of the week is that China's involvement in Ukraine is dangerous and we need to learn from it.
Yeah, that's for sure. My threat of the week is election fraud. And I want to turn back to Venezuela for a minute here. But from this perspective, we all know that election fraud, rigged elections, these are terms that we've kind of gotten accustomed to here in the U.S. over the past few years. Donald Trump talks about rigged elections. Democrats talk about how Republicans are a threat to democracy and, how Republicans at the state level might try to potentially reject the results of elections in November. Now, some of this, of course, has a basis in reality. There are rare instances of voter fraud, and there was an effort to try to reject some voting results back in 2020. But let's put it in perspective, guys. As you highlighted earlier, if anyone wants to see what an actual rigged election looks like, let's look at what's happened in Venezuela over the past few days. A lot of caveat here at the beginning that I'm not there on the ground, so we're relying on news reports and what we're hearing from the U.S. government and other stakeholders, but there seems to be a mounting pile of evidence that Venezuelan President Maduro has used the power of his socialist government to essentially produce fake election results. His government controls all the levers of power there, and they say that Maduro got over 50% of the vote compared to 44% for Edmundo Gonzalez, a former diplomat and Maduro's opponent in the presidential election. Those numbers were immediately suspicious to a lot of people. There was independent exit polling by Edison Research conducted at 100 polling places across Venezuela that found Gonzalez getting well over 60% of the vote, more than twice as much as Maduro. The U.S.-based Carter Center subsequently said through its work it couldn't verify the government numbers. The U.S., EU, as you mentioned, Guy, a lot of other countries around the world have cast doubt on the results and are calling on the Maduro government to make vote tally sheets and other information public. The Gonzalez camp said it actually has in its possession some of those physical vote tally sheets from polling places and that the results mirror the numbers from those Edison Research exit polls. So at the end of the day, it's not really clear what anyone outside Venezuela can do about this. The U.S. has tried its own soft version of regime change in Venezuela before to try to install former opposition leader Juan Guaido atop the country, and that didn't work. So here we are. I feel bad for the Venezuelan people if this, in fact, transpired the way it looks like it did. But I think it's a stark reminder for all of us here in the U.S., Guy, that words like, rigged election and voter fraud and abuse of power, those are very powerful terms, and they're not to be used lightly. And we're seeing what that actually looks like on the ground right now in Venezuela. And that's why it's my threat of the week.
Totally interesting, Ben. And once again, it's just great to be with you on the Threat Status podcast, man.
Thanks for being here, Guy. Thanks to Ted Singer for jumping on to talk about security threats at the Olympics. We certainly appreciate that. Thanks to all of you for listening. Once again, please go ahead, hit that subscribe button, share with all of your friends, and we will see you next week here on the Threat Status podcast.